opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, immediately staking a claim in the center of the board. Inviting a fight for central space, this Sicilian defense immediately injects sharp asymmetrical possibilities into the game. Rapidly developing a knight towards the center, this move prepares for pawn advances and challenges black's flexible setup. Solidifying the center and preparing a pawn chain defines black's response to white's open Sicilian gambit. Applying pressure with the bishop's discovered check prompts a critical decision for black's structure. Developing the knight to d7 sidesteps the immediate check, preparing to challenge white's bishop and reinforcing the central pawn structure. Securing the king immediately prioritizes safety, allowing for a more flexible development of other pieces and anticipating potential complications. Challenging white's bishop creates an immediate pawn structure decision, potentially weakening black's queenside. Refocusing the bishop's influence, preparing kingside expansion while subtly reinforcing the central pawn structure. Developing the knight towards the center now is a classic Sveshnikov preparation, aiming to challenge white's bishop on d3 and prepare d5. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this pawn thrust aims to gain space while safeguarding the bishop on d3, creating a harmonious pawn chain that promises a stable position and potential for future queenside play. Exploiting white's bishop retreat, black immediately contests the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play, a bold assertion of territorial ambition. Repositioning the bishop to c2 fortifies the kingside and prepares for d4, a crucial pawn thrust to challenge black's central control. Unveiling a subtle threat to penetrate the queenside. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal creates attacking potential on the kingside and prepares for further pawn breaks. Reorienting the queen to the e2 square prepares to challenge the d6 pawn's central influence and potentially support a kingside expansion, while also freeing up the d1 square for a rook if needed. Black's king now enjoys a potentially robust fianchetto defense, preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or a more stable pawn structure. Unlocking the center's potential, white boldly challenges the pawn chain's integrity and seeks to seize greater control of the board's heart. Unleashing the dark-squared bishop's potential, this maneuver gracefully prepares to castle and adds a crucial defender to the kingside pawn structure. It strategically opens a diagonal for the queen and subtly challenges white's central control by reinforcing the e5 square's influence. Clearing the path for the rook, white intends to seize the central file, potentially adding pressure along the d-file should black's pawns advance or exchange. This maneuver aims to enhance piece coordination and prepare for more aggressive central action, possibly supporting a future e5 pawn push or creating avenues for piece deployment. Initiating counterplay on the queen side is the primary aim, but be mindful of the potential for white to exploit the open d-file with their rook. Coordinating pieces for a more robust central presence will be crucial. Pushing the pawn here aggressively challenges black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses around black's king if the pawn advance is not met carefully. King safety now takes paramount importance as black tucks the monarch away behind the pawn's shield, a sensible precaution given white's ambition to pry open the center. The knight's embarkation to the queenside, a strategic pivot, aims to establish a more active presence, potentially eyeing the d5 square or reinforcing the queenside advance. This advance aggressively challenges white's queenside pawn structure, creating immediate tension and forcing a decision about the a4 pawn. The knight's retreat to b1 is a perplexing repositioning, suggesting a potential desire to reroute it to c3 or even d2, perhaps to support a d4 pawn push or to avoid immediate complications on the queenside where black's pawn storm is advancing. This knight's circuitous journey signals a pause in white's queenside pressure, allowing black to consolidate and potentially exploit the space gained with their b-pawn advance. It's a move that sacrifices immediate tempo for a more robust, long-term setup, but it allows black breathing room to continue their queenside expansion unimpeded for the moment. The question remains whether this subtle repositioning will ultimately pay dividends or simply surrender valuable initiative. Opening up the c-file with the capture dramatically alters the central landscape, creating immediate opportunities for aggressive piece play and posing critical questions about White's king's safety. Opening the c-file is the primary consequence, immediately putting pressure on Black's queenside pawn structure, which is now somewhat isolated. Securing the open c-file now becomes the immediate priority for Black, reinforcing control over a critical avenue that White's pieces are already eyeing. Preparing a knight maneuver towards the kingside, potentially to f3 or g4, seeking to improve its scope and participate in an attack against Black's uncastled king, while also reinforcing the central control from the somewhat passive knight on a3. Black boldly breaks the center, injecting immediate dynamism into the position and challenging White's pawn chain, aiming to disrupt the harmonious development White has painstakingly achieved, and potentially liberating the c8 rook and the dark-squared bishop. Aggressively sealing the queenside, White sacrifices space on the queenside for a more solid structure and potential kingside attack initiation. Unleashing the knight to this central outpost offers a dynamic challenge, aiming to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn chain and pry open the d-file for potential counterplay. Strategically repositioning the knight to the queenside, this maneuver anticipates a potential queenside pawn advance or aims to reinforce the e4 pawn from a safer square, avoiding immediate central skirmishes and preserving the option to support a central pawn break later. The pawn advances, opening a diagonal for the queen, but simultaneously creating a static weakness on the b5 square and potentially overextending the queenside. White pivots the knight to the queenside, aiming to reinforce the b3 square and potentially launch a future attack along the b-file, while also preparing to reposition the knight to a more active central outpost or support a pawn push. Liberating the bishop from its passive post, the exponent of the Sicilian is now actively seeking to control the long diagonal and potentially disrupt White's central control, creating active counterplay. The queen repositions, preparing to potentially reinforce the queenside or even shift to the kingside, a flexible redeployment aiming to meet Black's increasing queenside pressure. Challenging the center with a knight sortie, Ng4 immediately disrupts White's seemingly solid pawn structure and seeks to exploit potential weaknesses around the king. This aggressive maneuver aims to pry open lines and generate complications, forcing White to react decisively or face mounting pressure on their queenside. It's a bold declaration of intent, signaling a shift in the game's dynamics from positional maneuvering to a more direct confrontation. Unleashing a queenly raid into the heart of Black's position, this aggressive maneuver aims to exploit the vulnerability created by the pinned knight on f6 and the generally uncoordinated nature of Black's kingside. By directly targeting the g6 pawn and threatening further incursions down the h-file, White seeks to disrupt Black's developing plans and force concessions, potentially leading to a rapid attack against the castled monarch. Targeting the knight on b3, this capture drastically alters the pawn structure, immediately opening the c-file for your rook and preparing a potential assault on White's queenside. Consider the long-term consequences of exchanging these knights. White's king's knight now occupies a less central square, and Black gains significant scope for their own pieces along the newly liberated file. The ensuing pawn distribution will require careful management, as White might seek to exploit their central pawn majority, while Black aims to leverage the open lines for dynamic play. The bishop's relocation to b3 now directly challenges Black's advanced knight on c5, a piece that has been an active nuisance. White is aiming to eliminate this centralizing piece and regain some equilibrium in the center, which has become quite congested. This exchange, if it transpires, will open up lines and potentially create targets on the queenside. Consider how this piece trade might influence the subsequent control of the d-file and the possibilities for pawn advances or sacrifices later in the game. It's a subtle shift, but one that could significantly alter the tactical landscape. Sensing an opportunity to activate the kingside and potentially pry open lines towards White's king, Black initiates a pawn storm with this advance, aiming to create counterplay while White's pieces are still somewhat uncoordinated on the queenside. Focusing on the central tension, this maneuver aims to dislodge black's well-placed knight on c5, disrupting their pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. By repositioning the bishop, white seeks to activate it on a more dynamic diagonal, forcing black to make difficult decisions about defending their queenside and central squares. The slight compromise in pawn structure on the kingside with the bishop's retreat is a calculated risk to gain counterplay. The knight's sacrifice, foregoing its value to disrupt white's queenside structure and open attacking avenues, marks a crucial turning point. This audacious capture creates immediate tactical complications, potentially freeing black's position from the cramping influence of white's bishop on c2 and the knights on the queenside. The resultant pawn structure around white's king could become vulnerable, especially with black's pieces poised to exploit the newly created diagonal for the dark-squared bishop and the open h file for the rook. Reclaiming central influence and a bishop's diagonal dominance are now paramount as the queen returns to a more active position. Suddenly, the queens are brought into the fray, potentially igniting complications as black targets the central pawn structure and white's rather exposed monarch, hinting at a shift towards a more tactical battlefield. Simplifying the position with this exchange immediately opens up the queen's diagonal for black's remaining pieces, and potentially creates a passed pawn situation down the file if white isn't careful with the timing. The rook's arrival on the 5th rank immediately tightens the screws on white's queenside structure, a decisive point of pressure now that the exchanges have begun to simplify the battlefield. Establishing dominion over the central column is the immediate objective after the exchanges, preparing to press black's isolated pawns and potentially activate the rook for future operations. Rethinking the queen's departure, black seeks to activate the rook on the semi-open file, aiming for deeper penetration and potential pressure on white's central pawn structure. Simplifying the material count and opening up lines for the rooks is the primary intention here, aiming for a more manageable position after the exchange. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, forcing a more strategic battle in the reduced material environment. Securing the king's sanctuary against immediate threats, this pawn advance strategically bolsters the kingside pawn structure, creating a defensive barrier and preventing black's pieces from easily infiltrating the 7th rank. Initiating a subtle repositioning, the bishop embarks on a circuitous route, seeking to bolster the kingside pawn structure and potentially reroute itself to a more active diagonal, hinting at a prolonged positional struggle where piece maneuvering takes precedence over immediate fireworks. Navigating towards the rook's influence, white repositions a knight to a more active central square, aiming to bolster its central presence and potentially coordinate an attack on the black kingside. Asserting dominion over the c-file, this maneuver readies the rook for potential breakthroughs, simultaneously preparing to challenge white's pawn structure on the queenside, a proactive stance in a relatively balanced position. Solidifying the kingside structure and preparing for potential pawn advances, this maneuver aims to fortify the monarch's safety while subtly restricting black's active pieces. Consolidating the king's safety is paramount. Moving it to g7 offers a bit more breathing room from any potential threats along the open files, and also prepares it for a more active role later if the opportunity arises, perhaps supporting a pawn push or helping to secure a weak square. Clearing a direct path for the king's ultimate safety, this step initiates a crucial repositioning from the perceived danger zone of the back rank, aiming to consolidate forces and prepare for potential pawn pushes or even a central breakout. Injecting dynamism into the pawn structure, by advancing the f-pawn seizes central space and initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's solid position and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. f3 * the king's shelter weakens. While aiming to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn storm, this move fundamentally compromises white's king's safety by opening a diagonal for black's bishop. The pawn on f3 now becomes a permanent target, creating potential weaknesses that black's pieces can exploit. This positional concession could lead to immediate tactical dangers or long-term strategic disadvantages as black's pieces gain entry into white's camp. The king, previously well protected, now faces increased scrutiny and potential attacks down the open diagonal. The bishop's advance to e3 establishes a formidable presence on the long diagonal, threatening to infiltrate white's kingside and creating immediate pressure. Clearing the central files opens a pathway for your rook to become active, potentially unbalancing the endgame you're drifting into. Reopening the g-file grants your king a breath of air, but concurrently creates a pathway for white's pieces to infiltrate, demanding vigilant defense of the weakened dark squares. Unleashing a kingside pawn, Storm now aims to disrupt black's king's safety and create attacking chances on that flank, injecting a dynamic element into what was becoming a rather static position. Exposing the king's fortress now invites a direct assault along the h-file. This aggressive pawn push, while opening lines, creates significant structural weaknesses that invite further tactical skirmishes. Opening the f-file now drastically alters the position, aiming to exploit the now exposed black king and create immediate attacking chances. Embracing the chaos, black's pawn lunges forward, a daring probe into white's newly formed structure, aiming to disrupt any semblance of central stability and create dynamic counterplay. The knight's journey to f2 signals a desire to reinforce the beleaguered kingside, a critical reassessment after black's energetic pawn thrust. White is strategically accepting a slightly passive posture, aiming to consolidate and potentially find counterplay by activating this knight on a more central square later, perhaps via g4 or even e4 if the opportunity arises. It's a patient approach, prioritizing defensive solidity over immediate tactical aggression, a sensible decision given the exposed pawn structure and the lingering threats around the king. This knight's sacrifice on the previous move has created an imbalance, and now white is seeking to stabilize this new reality by repositioning a key defender. The bishop retreats to a more active square, eyeing potential targets on the kingside and offering a potential defensive outpost. Reasserting command of the central files, the rook now eyes the potential weaknesses created by black's pawn pushes, preparing to exploit the open lines and support any advances that might arise. Exploiting the immediate instability of the king's position, this check seeks to disrupt white's coordination and potentially expose the monarch to further attack. Relocating the monarch to the g1 square to escape the immediate diagonal threat opens up a safer corridor, though it does leave the king somewhat exposed to potential future skirmishes along the f-file. The pawn thrust aims to pry open the kingside further, potentially creating attacking chances against the white king or at least forcing concessions to gain space. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside is white's intent, aiming to pry open lines and create immediate threats against the black monarch, even if it means sacrificing material for initiative. The black king, no longer sheltered by pawns, now ventures into the center, a bold maneuver seeking activity amidst the exchanged pieces.